Monopolies, oligarchy, the striving for domination and not for freedom, the exploitation for an increasing number of small or weak nations, all these have given birth to those distinctive characteristics of imperialism which compel us to define it as parasitic or decaying capitalism. So those few lines from Lenin's Imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism remind me of Ursula Guin's story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. If you haven't read the story, I'm going to spoil it, so if you want to read it first, please go ahead and do that. But in the story, we are shown a utopian place named Omelas, and supposedly everything is great in there and everyone's happy, and the author actually invites us to partake in the imagining of what a utopian society would look like. But this place has a dark secret. There is a child living in the basement, and the child is there involuntarily. The child is locked and is malnourished and lives in terrible conditions. So everyone in this place, Omelas, knows of the existence of the child. In fact, once they reach a certain age, the child is shown to them, and most of them are horrified by the conditions in which the child lives, yet ultimately all of them consent to the child being there. And a few of their ponderings are given to us by the author. Some of them justify the child being there because supposedly the entire place's happiness depends on the child's suffering. So, and those who disagree, those few who cannot live with the thought of this child suffering continuously on behalf of everyone else, they leave the city of Omelas. We're not told where they're going, so it is left to the reader's imagination. So the reason why I am reminded of this as I'm reading about imperialism and the exploitation of these small and weak nations, as Lenin describes them, is because we now live in conditions that are somewhat resembling this utopia of Omelas. So we all receive goods that are made by slaves. And we know of the terrible conditions these people experience. And yet we still justify it in our minds. We say, well, someone has to do the work. And when I discuss the story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, with others, they are perplexed at first. And then when the real world comparison is given to them, they might at first refuse the notion that we live in a similar world, because it's not a pleasant thought that our happiness, so to speak, depends on the suffering of others. And it doesn't have to be this way. So if you look at the exploitation of many nations by imperialist countries, you will see that their progress is greatly hindered, and that many of these places cannot fully develop on their own because they're not allowed. Because if the quality of their lives is going to rise, if the well-being of the people is going to rise, then they're not going to sell their labor cheaply, and they're not going to produce under terrible, inhumane circumstances. So the imperialists are very aware of that. So they keep certain nations in certain conditions. So I'm not going to go into how, because, this is somewhat of a controversial area. But the people in the so-called developing countries oftentimes feel even more powerless because they greatly depend on the empires of the world. So these places are ruled by the dictatorship of capitalism. So those people cannot, in such conditions, work on improving their life, on increasing the levels of education, on increasing the levels of well-being of the people. Those people are from birth bound to worse life than the so-called developed world. So it is artificial, this hindrance that is put on these nations. So some of us, to live in this fictional city of Omelas, and we refuse to accept responsibility for the fact that these children are suffering for our sake, and that if we do not do anything about that, then their blood is on our hands too. And that's a very unpleasant thought to live with. Obviously, a single individual cannot change much, but we have to unite and think together about how to change that. And there is a lot of literature present to explain just how to do it. And the discussion is open. We can keep on thinking together of how to change that for better.